Hi all, welcome back to the 2013 film blog. As you might see, we're in slightly different surroundings today. Apologies for the delay in getting this latest review online, but obviously there's been quite a big move in my life, so obviously we're now here in London town, broadcasting from now on, but hopefully we can now get back to normal service being resumed. We've actually only missed the one film since I last broadcast on here, which was Kick-Ass 2, so we're going to have a look at that today. Now, I think one of the things you always have to say is that it's always a problem in creating a sequel to a film that garnered so much great praise as Kick-Ass did, certainly from where I am. When I first went to watch Kick-Ass, it really didn't seem at all my kind of thing, but against it all, absolutely loved it. Now, problem is, you can't really have avoided the panning that Kick-Ass 2 has been getting from certain sections of the media, and certainly not when you factor in things that Jim Carrey's been saying about how he withdraws his support for the film because he thinks it glamorises violence, and in the wake of some of the high school shootings in the US, he feels that the film is no longer appropriate. Possibly your argument might be that it's a bit late to change your mind after you've done the film, and also the fact is that this is quite frankly blatantly not real. It's a comic book fantasy, it's not real life. But, you know, it's up to him to decide how he feels about it. So, second of all, obviously you cannot review Kick-Ass 2 without doing some kind of spoilers involving Kick-Ass 1, so if you haven't seen the first one, please go away until you've seen it, because inevitably you're going to have to get a spoiler here. So, we all know that at the end of Kick-Ass, Nicolas Cage's character, Big Daddy, has been killed off, as has the main gangster bad guy killed by Kick-Ass with a giant bazooka being thrown out of his office window. So, Kick-Ass 2, it starts off with what was undoubtedly the star of Kick-Ass 1, which is Chloe Moretz as Hit Girl, which she has now been taken in and fostered by her father's old partner, and she's now trying to live life as a normal girl in a normal high school. And it's an interesting way of going with things. I mean, the fact is that you can call the film Kick-Ass 2 all you like. Quite frankly, it is the Hit Girl film, because that's all that anyone's really there to see, and I think, quite frankly, the producers know that. So there's certainly, in the beginning, there's not all that much of Kick-Ass, but there's an awful lot of Hit Girl. So that's sort of where the film has started to go. It's talking about what you have in the first film, which was basically an adolescent who had an absolutely filthy mouth, who was exceptionally violent, and it was all about how much did her upbringing and Nicolas Cage's character effectively rob her of her childhood, and are the problems that she has now in trying to adjust to real life, how much are those to do with what he did? And it's an interesting sort of idea, I'll admit. And for a lot of the film, it really does work, because you've got sort of two narrative strands. You've got the one strand which is about Hit Girl trying to adjust to civilian life, having promised her guardian that she will put away her cape forever and she will no longer be Hit Girl. And then there's the other sort of strand, which is the slightly more wacky comic book style strand, which is all to do with Chris D'Amico, if you remember in the first film. He played Red Mist, sort of the bungling anti-hero, as it were. And obviously his father was killed by Kick-Ass, and so sort of in a Green Goblin style way of doing things, he's now out for revenge and trying to work out how to kill Kick-Ass. And through a strange, convoluted series of events, he ends up killing his mother. and so he ends up basically being the sole heir to the fortune, and decides rather than being a superhero, he wants to be the world's first supervillain, and so he sets about assembling a crew of villains who will come together and they will try and lure Kick-Ass and his crew and take them down. And so you've got these two divergent threads, and it's quite interesting because a lot of the film you're seeing Chloe Moretz not as Hit Girl, you're seeing her as Mindy. And that's quite an interesting way of doing things. I'll certainly say the areas in which the film is strongest are still the ones where you can see why the original Kick-Ass was so good, where it just sort of, it turns from very black humour to ultra-violence in seconds. And there are still some real scenes of that where you really do get this dark, bitter humour coming through. And it's good at times to sort of watch that. I would say there are a number of problems with it, but in terms of occasionally you do see glimpses of what made the first film so brilliant. So I certainly wouldn't go down the route of sort of the one-star pannings that's been giving it. There are elements, certainly towards the end of Jim Carrey's role as Colonel Sergeant Stripes. Now, as his cameo ends, those are exceptionally good scenes. There are some pretty good scenes in terms of the supervillain, big fight at the end, because it's all gearing up towards this huge showdown between all these new superheroes and all these new supervillains to try and see who comes out on top. So, I mean, it's not to say there's not a lot within it to enjoy. There is, and certainly I wasn't really bored for any of it. But I think there are a number of problems that have to get addressed. First of all, I think there's a real issue with the sexualisation of Chloe Grace Moretz's character. Now, in the first Kick-Ass, it was heavily criticised for the fact that at one point they have Chloe Grace Moretz as Mindy, as it were, in her school uniform holding a gun, and how that had been too sexualised. That's fair enough to make that comment, and I think possibly that scene, it's there to shock. That's what it's there to do. So I can see why it was there, but an awful lot of this second film, they're trying to play too much on that. They're trying to play too much on this idea of teenage sexualisation, and maybe that's the reality of what teenage life is at the moment. But at times, it does feel very, very awkward the way they're doing it. The idea of the teenage cliques and how you desperately want to be included, again, it doesn't really sit well with me, in that doesn't really fit with the character of Hit Girl, or Mindy as she is at the moment. That character was supposed to be a strong, feisty, independent woman, and suddenly you're seeing that she's being forced within these cliques and whatever else, and it for me doesn't really sit. I mean, maybe it's the whole point of the film. I'm not sure, but if it wasn't made clear, and for me it just seemed a development of the character that didn't really seem to fit. But all power to it. I mean, the fact is, as I say, it's at no point becomes a boring film. It's very, very watchable. It's just, ultimately, it's not Kick-Ass 1. And I think for me, certainly the major problem that we have with it is, it's going to sound strange, but with Kick-Ass 1, you always sort of felt that the events being portrayed might really happen. I know it seems really, really stupid, but the fact was that the scenes of violence, you felt that was real violence, certainly on the streets, when Dave/Kick-Ass starts getting beaten up. That was what was really good. It was the fact there was genuine danger involved, and it's the fact that it's not like in so many superhero tropes, where the superhero simply keeps getting beaten and keeps coming back up again. In Kick-Ass 1, the fact was that at times he is beaten, and at times he is coming through a really, really bloody beating. And he doesn't always win. The fact is, you're not always certain that he's going to win out the day. I tend to find with Kick-Ass 2, the whole thing just sort of fell over into parody, went beyond what it was supposed to be. There are times when there are really, really good scenes of genuine, terrifying violence, and they're horrible. But, I mean, certainly towards the end, when Hit Girl returns, you have sort of the final big fight is obviously between Chris D'Amico as the motherfucker and with Kick-Ass. But that's sort of sidelined by a second fight between Hit Girl and the right-hand man of Motherfucker, who's called Mother Russia. And for me, that fight just... I mean, it didn't even jump the shark. It leapt over the shark. It was such a stupid parody way of doing things. You think about how good some of the fight scenes were in Kick-Ass 1, and they've decided for number 2 to go down that route. I mean, the amount of punishment Hit Girl takes, you wouldn't be alive. It would not happen. And that's what sort of frustrated me, is that for as much as Kick-Ass 1 was fantasy, there was always an element which said to you, okay, this may be a fantasy story, but potentially this could really happen. Whereas with Kick-Ass 2, it too often falls over on that one, and you don't think it could really happen. It becomes... The point was that Kick-Ass was supposed to be a parody of superheroes, and saying, you know, if this was to really happen, this is what actually the result would be. Quite frankly, you get a lot of people getting very, very badly hurt. And yet, you sort of find with Kick-Ass 2, it's gone too far the other way. It's no longer parodying the tropes of a superhero film. It's actually trying to become a superhero film. It's trying to have this strong moral lesson, which is fine, you can have that, but it's lost the reality somewhere on the way, which I appreciate saying as a criticism of a fantasy film, it's lost the reality. It may seem slightly stupid, but that's, for me, what the great thing about Kick-Ass was that for all the incredible things it did, ultimately, that was a story that could really have happened. Whereas this... I'll admit I was just very, very disappointed at times with it. And there are particularly some scenes... I don't want to go into spoiler territory here. Certainly the way that Hit Girl ends her fight with Mother Russia, you know how it has to end. But the way it's done, I felt just... No, sorry, not buying that at all. That's no good. And also... At one point, she decides to get her revenge on the clique girls after she is humiliated. And she does it by the most stupid method. I'm thinking, you've missed it again. The whole point is, what is realistic? What could actually happen here? Because that's the whole strength of this franchise, by saying, what could really happen? And ultimately, things like that just go too far. I'm thinking, well, that's just not realistic. Why are you doing this? All you're doing now is going towards the sort of superhero traits, which is the one thing the Kick-Ass didn't do. So, honestly, I'm not down on the film. It's certainly not something that isn't worth going to see. My only argument with it would be that, first of all, it's not Kick-Ass 1. And secondly, it forgets what it was that made Kick-Ass 1 such a different and brilliant film. The fact was that it wasn't surrendering to these tropes, it was parodying them, and in a really, really clever way. And there was genuine fear and danger. I mean, certainly in Kick-Ass 1, the death of Nicolas Cage's character, that's a really terrifying scene, because that's not what's supposed to happen in superhero films. In superhero films, the good guys are meant to always win. They never lose. The way he dies in Kick-Ass 1 is horrendous. And that's what made it so strong. Whereas, things like that, I mean, what they've tried to do for Kick-Ass 2 is to try and sort of, they're bringing in Jim Carrey to replace the Nicolas Cage character as sort of the older adult influence. I think the issue we've sort of got with that is that whether or not, following Jim Carrey's comments, some of his scenes have been cut, I don't know, but his role does seem to be a very, very strange one in that he's either criminally underused or it's a part for which he's been grossly miscast. Because what you sort of want in that character as Colonel Stars and Stripes is perhaps more sort of, because Jim Carrey in full-on Jim Carrey mode could have done that role quite well. It would sort of have been a mixture of his performance as the Riddler in Batman Forever and sort of his Ace Ventura kind of characters. In that would have quite worked, but the way it is, it just seems a strange odd part that A, for him to have taken, and then B, for them to have cast. It just seems we've got a star of that magnitude. The part just seems very much tacked on. It's not really important to the storyline. So that's disappointing. I mean, as I say, I'm not saying it's a bad film. I certainly wouldn't go with the panning that it's been getting from other critics. I just think that all too often it forgets what it's really about. And watching the ending, I think, for me, it's pretty obvious there will be a third film. Whether it will be Kick-Ass 3 or whether it will be the Hit Girl movie, I don't know. I think there will be a sequel done. And I think they need to have a good, strong look at what it was that made the first one so good and bring it back to that, to realise that what you're doing is parodying, but you're parodying in a really clever way, and there's a darkness to it. I mean, there are certainly elements of that in Kick-Ass 2, but all too often, as I say, it just completely jumps the shark. And it goes from believable parody to, no, sorry, I don't buy that, it just doesn't work. So ultimately, it's not a bad film, it's worth going to see, but I'm afraid, for me, it wasn't Kick-Ass 1, and it's lost too much, and I really, really hope by the third one, if it happens, which I assume it will, they bring back what it was that made the first one quite so brilliant. And I'll speak to you soon. Ta-ra.